A millionaire spots a black woman wearing family jewels. As DNA test results approach, what shocking truth about their connection will be revealed? And if you cherish your family and love videos like this, subscribe to our channel to have 10 years of luck in your life. The chandeliers cast a warm glow across the Chicago Charity Gala's Grand Ballroom, where Jacob Miller stood observing the crowd with practiced detachment. Despite his familiar surroundings, the crystal glasses tinkling, the murmur of practiced small talk, the subtle display of wealth, something felt different tonight. His attention kept drifting to a woman across the room, but not for the usual reasons that attracted his notice at such events. The woman wore an emerald green dress, elegant but not extravagant, yet what caught his eye were the striking vintage jewelry pieces she displayed. A necklace with an intricate design caught the light as she moved, speaking animatedly with various guests. Unlike the typical diamonds and precious stones that adorned most attendees, her pieces carried a distinctive character that spoke of history and meaning. Jacob found himself moving closer, drawn by both the jewelry and the natural confidence with which she carried herself. He noticed how other guests responded to her presence, not with the usual deference shown to wealth, but with genuine warmth. She introduced herself to people with firm handshakes rather than the delicate touches common in his social circle. When she turned slightly, he caught a better view of the necklace. Its design reminded him of something he'd seen in his grandmother's old photographs, though he couldn't quite place it. After 20 minutes of watching her interact with others, Jacob realized he'd spent more time studying her than he had any potential investment opportunity in the past year. Finally, during a lull in the conversations, he approached her. "I couldn't help but notice your jewelry," he said, skipping the usual social preliminaries. "The craftsmanship is remarkable." The woman turned to face him, and he saw her name tag, Tasha Green, Community Development Director. Her eyes carried a hint of amusement as she replied, "Most people start with hello, or at least their name." Jacob felt his carefully cultivated social polish slip slightly. "I apologize." Jacob Miller. He extended his hand, noting how her handshake matched the confidence he'd observed from afar. "I'm usually more practiced at this, but your jewelry pieces are genuinely fascinating." "These pieces have been in my family for generations," Tasha responded, her fingers touching the necklace with familiar affection. "My grandmother wore them during some of the most significant moments of her life. Each one carries a story." Jacob found himself drawn into conversation, forgetting the usual networking he conducted at such events. Tasha shared how her grandmother had received the necklace during the civil rights era, wearing it to meetings and marches. The earrings came from her great-grandmother, who'd saved for years to purchase them, declaring that her descendants would wear them in places she'd never been allowed to enter. As Tasha spoke, Jacob noticed subtle details in the jewelry's design that sparked recognition. The way the metal was worked, the distinctive setting style, they reminded him of pieces he'd seen in old family photos, though he'd never paid much attention to such details before. "Would you consider having the pieces authenticated?" he asked, his mind already working through possibilities. "I know experts who could trace their origins, perhaps uncover more of their history." Tasha's expression shifted slightly, a mix of interest and hesitation crossing her features. "These pieces are more than jewelry to me," she said carefully. "They're physical connections to my family's journey, their struggles, their triumphs. I'm not sure I want to reduce them to monetary value." Jacob shook his head quickly. That's not what I meant," he explained. "I've seen similar work before, and I suspect there might be more to their story. Have you considered DNA testing? Sometimes family histories intersect in unexpected ways." Tasha studied him for a long moment, her hand still resting on the necklace. The surrounding chatter of the gala seemed to fade as she considered his suggestion. Finally, she said, "You know, my grandmother always said these pieces would help tell our family's story someday." I never quite understood what she meant by that. The evening continued, but their conversation remained focused on family histories and the stories embedded in inherited objects. Jacob found himself sharing details about his own grandmother, surprising himself with memories he hadn't revisited in years. As the gala drew to a close, Tasha agreed to consider the DNA testing, though Jacob sensed her agreement came more from curiosity about her own history than his interest in the jewelry. They exchanged contact information, and as Jacob watched her leave, he realized this evening had shifted something in his carefully ordered world. The jewelry had caught his eye, but it was the history behind them, and the woman who carried that history with such grace, that had captured his attention completely. Jacob sat in his downtown office, researching DNA testing laboratories with the same intensity he usually reserved for investment opportunities. The morning sun reflected off nearby skyscrapers as he made calls, vetted credentials, and compiled a list of the most reputable facilities. Each time he mentioned the project, he found himself explaining more than necessary about the jewelry's historical significance, catching himself becoming personally invested in ways that extended beyond mere curiosity. Across town, Tasha stood before her bathroom mirror, holding the cotton swab that would collect her DNA sample. She hadn't told her family about the test yet, unsure how to explain her sudden interest in genetic ancestry. The jewelry box containing her grandmother's pieces sat open on the counter, catching the fluorescent light. As she prepared for the sample collection, memories of her childhood flooded back. She remembered sitting on her grandmother's lap, reaching for the necklace with small hands while stories of family history filled her ears. Their small apartment in the South Side had been filled with photographs, each one accompanied by a story of struggle and triumph. Now, standing in her own modest apartment, Tasha wondered what other stories might emerge from this investigation. During their next meeting, over dinner at a quiet restaurant away from the usual society spots, Jacob and Tasha found themselves sharing more personal histories. Jacob swirled his wine glass, his usual confident demeanor slipping as he spoke about his family's expectations. "The Miller name comes with obligations," he explained, his voice carrying a weight Tasha hadn't heard before. "Every decision, every investment, every public appearance is scrutinized. The family foundation requires constant attention to maintain our social position." He paused, studying the dark liquid in his glass. "Sometimes I wonder if we've lost sight of its original purpose." Tasha nodded, understanding family pressure from a different perspective. "In my neighborhood, everyone knew everyone else's business, but it was about survival, not status. When someone's electricity got cut off, neighbors ran extension cords between houses. When food was scarce, people shared what they had." She touched her grandmother's necklace, a habitual gesture Jacob had noticed becoming familiar. "My grandmother taught me that true wealth isn't in what you have, but in what you share." Their conversations deepened over subsequent meetings. Jacob found himself sharing doubts he'd never voiced about his family's approach to philanthropy, while Tasha spoke about her work in community development, describing the challenges of building trust between wealthy donors and struggling neighborhoods. The usual barriers of race and class that might have separated them began to fade, replaced by a growing understanding of their shared humanity. Jacob noticed how Tasha's direct approach to problems refreshed his often cynical worldview, while Tasha found herself appreciating Jacob's systematic thinking about creating lasting change. During one particularly candid evening, Jacob admitted, "I've spent years in boardrooms discussing community investment, but I've never really understood the communities we claim to serve. Meeting you has changed my perspective on what effective philanthropy could look like." Tasha considered his words carefully before responding. "And I've sometimes been so focused on immediate needs that I've overlooked the importance of sustainable, long-term planning. Maybe that's why our grandmother's generation managed to create lasting change. They understood both the immediate struggles and the long-term vision." As they awaited the DNA test results, their professional lives began to intersect. Jacob attended community meetings with Tasha, witnessing firsthand the impact of grassroots organizing. Tasha, in turn, provided valuable insight at foundation board meetings, helping to bridge the gap between donor intentions and community needs. The jewelry that had initially drawn them together became a symbol of their growing partnership. Each piece seemed to carry new meaning as they learned more about each other's backgrounds. The necklace that had caught Jacob's eye at the gala now represented not just Tasha's family history, but a potential bridge between their worlds. Their different perspectives began to complement rather than clash. Where Jacob saw investment opportunities, Tasha saw community potential. Where Tasha recognized social barriers, Jacob could identify systemic solutions. Together, they started envisioning ways to combine their strengths for greater impact. The tension between their different backgrounds didn't disappear entirely, but it evolved into something productive. Their discussions about privilege, responsibility, and social change became more nuanced, informed by their growing understanding of each other's realities. In his home office late one evening, Jacob found himself drawn to the boxes of family memorabilia he'd retrieved from storage. The leather-bound albums and carefully preserved documents had always seemed like mere obligations to maintain, part of the Miller family's meticulous record-keeping. Now, as he carefully turned the yellowed pages, he searched for something specific, any trace of a connection that might explain the familiar craftsmanship of Tasha's jewelry. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. In a small, unmarked envelope tucked between the pages of a 1960s social registry, Jacob discovered several photographs he'd never seen before. His grandmother, Elizabeth Miller, appeared in them, but not in the formal poses he was accustomed to seeing. Instead, she sat in what appeared to be a modest kitchen, laughing with another woman. The other woman wore the same necklace that now adorned Tasha's neck. Jacob's hands trembled slightly as he examined the photographs more closely. His grandmother, always portrayed in family lore as a proper society matron, looked completely at ease in these informal settings. Her smile reached her eyes in a way he'd never seen in official family portraits. The two women sat close together, sharing what looked like private jokes and intimate conversations. He immediately called Tasha, despite the late hour. When she answered, the excitement in his voice was palpable. "Our grandmothers knew each other," he said without preamble. Not just knew each other, they were friends. Close friends, from what these pictures show. Tasha's initial skepticism gave way to curiosity as Jacob described the photographs. "That's impossible," she said, but her tone suggested she was already considering the possibility. "My grandmother never mentioned knowing anyone from your family's social circle. These aren't society photos," Jacob explained. "They're personal, intimate. They're sitting in what looks like a home kitchen, sharing coffee, laughing together. Your grandmother is wearing the necklace you have now." The next day, they met at a small cafe halfway between their homes. Jacob brought the photographs, carefully protected in acid-free sleeves. As he spread them across the table, Tasha's breath caught. "That's my grandmother's kitchen," she said softly, touching one of the images. "I remember those curtains. She made them herself." The photographs revealed a friendship that defied the social conventions of their time. There were images of the two women at what appeared to be civil rights meetings, their heads bent together over documents. Another showed them in a garden, soil on their hands as they planted something together. In every image, their body language spoke of deep familiarity and trust. "Look at this one," Tasha said, pointing to a photograph where both women wore elegant evening wear. "This must be from some society event, but I've never seen this picture before. My grandmother kept every photograph she ever took. Why wouldn't she have kept this one?" Jacob studied the image. "This was taken at the annual Miller Foundation Gala, 1965, he said, recognizing the backdrop. "But I've never seen this photo in our family archives either." They must have kept their friendship private. As they continued examining the photographs, more questions emerged. Why had neither grandmother ever mentioned this friendship to their families? How had they managed to maintain such a close relationship across the social and racial divisions of their time? And most intriguingly, why had they chosen to keep it hidden? "There must be more," Jacob said, his investment researcher's instincts kicking in. "These photos survived for a reason. They were preserved, hidden away, but not destroyed. They wanted someone to find them eventually." Tasha nodded, her community organizer's mind already working through possibilities. "We need to look deeper. If they were involved in civil rights work together, there might be records, meeting minutes, organization documents, anything that could tell us more about their connection." They spent the rest of the afternoon making plans to investigate further. Jacob would search through his family's foundation records, while Tasha would reach out to her grandmother's old friends and community contacts. The jewelry that had initially brought them together now seemed like just one piece of a much larger puzzle. As they parted that evening, Both felt the weight of their discovery. Their grandmother's hidden friendship hinted at a deeper story, one that might explain the strange familiarity they'd felt since their first meeting at the gala. Neither spoke their growing suspicion that the DNA test might reveal more than just a casual connection between their families. The leather-bound diary sat between them on Tasha's kitchen table, its worn cover telling of years of frequent handling. Tasha had found it while searching through her grandmother's belongings, tucked away in an old hatbox along with letters and small trinkets. The pages carried the distinct scent of age and memory, and as she opened it, her hands moved with reverence. "My grandmother wrote in this diary every day for over 40 years, Tasha explained, carefully turning to the earliest entries from 1960. "I never read it while she was alive. It felt too personal then." She paused, her finger tracing the careful handwriting. "But now, I think she meant for us to find it." Jacob leaned forward, noticing how the handwriting, though aged, remained clear and determined. The first entry they focused on spoke of dreams bigger than their time allowed. "Today, I met a woman who understands what it means to want more for your community than so. Society says you deserve. Elizabeth Miller may wear pearls and drive a fine car, but her heart beats with the same rhythm as mine." As they read through the entries, a picture emerged of two women who shared a vision far ahead of their time. Tasha's grandmother, Rose Green, wrote about establishing community programs, creating safe spaces for neighborhood children, and fighting for equal education. Throughout the entries, Elizabeth Miller's name appeared repeatedly, not as a wealthy benefactor, but as a trusted ally and friend. "Listen to this," Tasha said, reading from an entry dated 1963. "Elizabeth brought more than money today. She brought hope. While others throw dollars at problems from a safe distance, she sits with us, listens to our stories, shares our tears. Today she said something I'll never forget. Rose, they think wealth is about what you own, but real wealth is about who you lift up along the way." Jacob sat back, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of amazement. The grandmother described in these pages differed vastly from the stern family matriarch he remembered. The diary revealed a woman who questioned her privilege, who worked in secret to support civil rights initiatives, who found in Rose Green not just a friend but a partner in creating meaningful change. One particular entry caught both their attention. Rose wrote about the jewelry, the very pieces that had first drawn Jacob's attention to Tasha at the gala. "Elizabeth insisted I take these pieces," the entry read. "She says they're more than just jewelry, they're a promise. These will remind our grandchildren," she told me, "that real change happens when people dare to cross the lines others draw to divide us." Jacob felt his throat tighten. "All these years," he said quietly, "we were told that those pieces were sold to fund the foundation's early projects. But she gave them to your grandmother instead. They were never meant to be just valuable assets." They continued reading, finding entries that detailed late-night planning sessions, secret meetings with civil rights leaders, and careful orchestration of community initiatives that neither family had known about. The diary revealed how the two women had worked together to create lasting change while maintaining the appearance of proper social distance in public. "My grandmother writes here about their dream," Tasha said, turning to a later entry. "They wanted to create a legacy of unity, to prove that meaningful change requires bringing people together across all divisions, race, class, status. But they knew their time wasn't ready for such openness." The most poignant entries came from the later years, when both women recognized that their work would need to continue through future generations. Rose wrote, "We've planted seeds that our grandchildren will need to nurture. Elizabeth and I know we may not see the full bloom of what we've started, but we trust that someday, those who come after us will understand and continue what we began." Jacob found himself deeply moved by the weight of this trust. "They knew," he said softly. "Somehow, they knew that we would find our way to each other, that we would discover their story and understand what they were trying to achieve." The South Side neighborhood hadn't changed as much as Tasha had expected. The same brick buildings line the streets, their facades weathered but dignified. As she guided Jacob along the familiar sidewalks, every corner held a memory. Children played double dutch on the sidewalk, just as she had decades ago. their jumping ropes creating rhythmic patterns against the concrete. The community mural that covered the eastern wall of her old apartment building had been restored recently, its colors vibrant against the aged brick. Jacob stopped abruptly when he saw it, his eyes fixed on two figures prominently featured in the center. There, painted larger than life, stood two women, one black, one white, their hands sped together, lifting up a community behind them. "That's them," he said softly, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Our grandmothers." The mural captured them as they must have appeared in the 1960s, young and determined, their faces bearing expressions of quiet strength. The artist had painted them surrounded by symbols of community growth, blooming gardens, children reading, new buildings rising from old foundations. Tasha watched Jacob's reaction carefully. "This mural was painted when I was a child," she explained. "I never understood why they chose to include a white woman in it. Nobody would tell me the full story. They just said she was a friend of the community." She touched the wall gently. "Now I know they were protecting their secret, preserving it until the right time." As they stood there, an elderly man approached them, leaning on a worn wooden cane. "You're Rose's granddaughter," he said to Tasha. It wasn't a question. "And you," he turned to Jacob. "You have Elizabeth's eyes." Mr. Johnson had lived in the building for over 50 years, and his memory remained sharp as ever. He led them to a nearby bench, settling down with the air of someone preparing to share long-held stories. "Those two women," he began, "they changed everything, but they did it so quietly most folks never knew. Your grandmother," he nodded to Jacob, "she didn't just write checks. She came here, sat in our kitchens, listened to our stories. And your grandmother," he turned to Tasha, "she made sure every dollar went exactly where it was needed most." Mr. Johnson shared how the two women had created a network of support that operated beneath the surface of Chicago's segregated society. They established unofficial channels for funding community initiatives, created safe spaces for civil rights meetings, and helped countless young people access education and opportunities. "See that building there?" He pointed to a restored Victorian structure down the street. "That was going to be demolished. Your grandmothers worked together to save it, turned it into the first community-owned business center in the neighborhood. Elizabeth provided the funds through a maze of corporations so nobody could trace it back to the Millers, and Rose organized the community to run it." The stories continued as other longtime residents recognized Tasha and joined them. Each person added another piece to the puzzle of their grandmother's shared legacy. One woman remembered how Elizabeth and Rose had secretly funded a scholarship program for neighborhood children. Another recalled how they had protected families during the most violent periods of the civil rights movement. Jacob listened intently, his investment banker's mind calculating the risks his grandmother had taken, the careful planning required to hide her involvement from Chicago's social elite. "She could have lost everything," he said quietly. "The foundation, the family's social position, all of it." "That's what made it matter," Mr. Johnson replied. "She chose to risk her privilege to do what was right. And your grandmother," he looked at Tasha. "She risked just as much in her own way, building trust between two worlds that weren't supposed to mix." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the neighborhood as they continued their tour. Every storefront seemed to hold another story, each corner another revelation about the quiet revolution their grandmothers had orchestrated. The jewelry that had brought them together now seemed like just one small part of a much larger legacy of courage and collaboration. The genetic testing laboratory occupied the top floor of a sleek medical building downtown. Jacob found himself checking the appointment date repeatedly as the day drew closer, each passing hour heightening his awareness of what these results might mean. The weight of possibility pressed against his chest whenever he thought about it. In his penthouse apartment, surrounded by the trappings of Miller family success, Jacob spent evenings sorting through more family photographs. Each image of his grandmother now carried new meaning, forcing him to reevaluate everything he thought he knew about his family's history. He noticed details he'd missed before, the subtle tension in Elizabeth's posture during formal society events, the careful distance she maintained from others in public photographs, so different from the warmth she showed in those private moments with Rose. Meanwhile, Tasha immersed herself in preparation work for the test, methodically documenting her known family history. She created detailed family trees, noting the gaps and inconsistencies that had never bothered her before. Her grandmother's diary lay open on her desk, certain passages now highlighted and annotated as she searched for clues about what the test might reveal. During a particularly restless evening, Jacob called Tasha. "What if we find something that changes everything?" he asked, his usual confident tone replaced by genuine uncertainty. "The foundation, the family name, everything I've built my life around, it could all shift depending on what we discover." Tasha understood his anxiety, but approached it from a different angle. "Maybe that's exactly what our grandmothers wanted," she suggested. "Think about it. They preserved evidence of their friendship, left us breadcrumbs to follow. They must have known these discoveries would force both our families to confront uncomfortable truths." The weekend before the test, they met for coffee in a quiet cafe. The conversation flowed between them naturally now, months of shared discovery having forged a deep connection. Yet underneath their easy rapport lay a current of nervous energy. They both knew they stood on the brink of potentially life-altering revelations. "I've been thinking about identity," Tasha said, warming her hands around her coffee cup. "About how we build our sense of self around the stories we're told about our families. What happens when those stories turn out to be incomplete or even intentionally misleading?" Jacob nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "I was raised to believe that the Millers had always been separate from the communities we helped, benevolent but distant. Now I wonder how many other connections were hidden, how many relationships were disguised to maintain that illusion of separation." They shared a moment of companionable silence, each lost in thought. The cafe bustled around them, but they remained in their own world of contemplation and possibility. Finally, Tasha spoke again, her voice soft but determined. "Whatever we discover," she said, "it won't change what our grandmothers accomplished. If anything, it might help us understand the true depth of their courage. They found ways to work together, to create real change, in a time when such cooperation was almost impossible." The day before the test, Jacob visited his grandmother's grave for the first time in years. The polished granite headstone listed her social accomplishments, her charitable works, her role as a pillar of Chicago society. Yet now he knew these formal accolades told only a fraction of her story. He placed a single rose on her grave, wondering what other secrets she had carried to protect those she cared about. That same evening, Tasha sat in her grandmother's old rocking chair, the jewelry box open in her lap. Each piece seemed to pulse with new significance. "What else were you trying to tell us?" she whispered, running her fingers over the familiar patterns. "What other truths did you hide in plain sight?" The genetic testing facility's waiting room reflected the sterile professionalism typical of medical buildings, but for Jacob and Tasha, every white wall and generic painting seemed to vibrate with significance. They had arranged to receive their results in person, both feeling that such revelations deserved more than an impersonal email or phone call. Dr. Sarah Chun, the geneticist overseeing their case, noticed their tension as soon as they entered her office. She had handled countless family history revelations throughout her career, but something about these two clients struck her as unique. The way they sat, close but not too close, each maintaining a careful distance while obviously drawing support from the other's presence, spoke volumes about their complex relationship. "Before we review the results," Dr. Chin began, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing information, "I want to remind you that genetic connections often tell us unexpected stories about our ancestors. What we find in DNA can sometimes challenge our existing narratives about family history." Jacob's hands gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles whitening slightly. The businessman who routinely handled million-dollar negotiations now found himself struggling to maintain his composure. Beside him, Tasha unconsciously touched her grandmother's necklace, the familiar gesture grounding her in the moment. Dr. Chen opened their file on her computer, turning the screen so they could both see. "Your DNA samples revealed something quite remarkable," she explained, pulling up a detailed genetic map. "You share a significant amount of genetic material, indicating a family connection that goes back approximately 3 generations." The room seemed to still, as the implications sank in. Dr. Chin continued, her finger tracing lines on the screen. Based on the genetic markers we've identified, you appear to be related through a common ancestor. The pattern suggests you're third cousins sharing great-great-grandparents. Tasha released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Third cousins, she repeated, testing the words. The jewels at her throat seemed to warm against her skin, as if responding to this confirmation of what their grandmothers must have known. Jacob leaned forward, his analytical mind already working through the implications. Can you tell us more about the nature of the connection? Through which family line? Dr. Chin navigated through several screens of data. The genetic markers suggest the connection comes through your paternal lines. This means your father's family, Mr. Miller, and your father's mother's family, Ms. Green, share common ancestors. The revelation hit them both differently. Jacob felt a sudden shift in his understanding of his family's carefully maintained social position. All those generations of Miller family pride in their pure lineage, what else had been hidden beneath the surface of their polished family narrative? Tasha's reaction was more complex. Her father had always told stories about his mother's family's strength during the civil rights era, but now those stories carried new weight. How many other connections had been disguised or buried to protect people during those dangerous times? There's more, Dr. Chin added, pulling up another screen. The genetic markers show some interesting patterns that suggest your ancestors likely lived in the same community in the late 1800s, possibly in South Carolina, before migrating north during the Great Migration. The history they'd been uncovering through photographs and diaries suddenly extended back much further than they'd imagined. Their grandmother's friendship wasn't just a remarkable bridge across social divisions. It was, perhaps unconsciously, a reconnection of families separated by time and circumstance. The days following the DNA test results created a strange liminal space for both Jacob and Tasha. Each retreated into their own world to process the implications of their newfound connection. Jacob canceled his meetings for the week, something he had never done before, citing a family matter that required his immediate attention. The irony of that excuse wasn't lost on him. In his penthouse apartment, Jacob spent hours staring at the Chicago skyline, the city lights, blurring as his mind raced through years of family history. Every childhood memory now required re-examination. He remembered formal Miller family gatherings where relatives had discussed their European heritage with such certainty, such pride. The leather-bound family histories in his father's study had traced their lineage back to colonial America, yet somehow missed, or deliberately omitted, these crucial connections. The foundation of his identity, built on generations of carefully cultivated Miller family mythology, began to crack. Each fissure revealed new questions. How many other family secrets lay buried beneath years of social positioning? How many connections had been deliberately obscured to maintain the illusion of racial and social separation? Meanwhile, Tasha found herself in her classroom after hours, surrounded by the student artwork and community project displays that defined her work. Her grandmother's fight for education and equality now carried additional layers of meaning. She thought about how Rose Green had known about this connection, but chose to protect it with silence, understanding that sometimes preservation requires concealment. The revelation forced Tasha to confront her own preconceptions about privilege and identity. She had always viewed the wealthy white community as fundamentally separate from her own, an other, to be negotiated with but never truly understood. Now, biology itself had challenged that narrative, proving that the lines between communities were far more permeable than anyone had acknowledged. After 3 days of separate contemplation, they met at a small jazz club on the South Side, a place where the music made conversation both possible and unnecessary. The familiar blues progressions filled the air between them as they sat in a corner booth, each waiting for the other to speak first. "I've been thinking about power," Jacob finally said, his voice barely carrying over the saxophone's mellow tones. "About how much energy our families spent maintaining artificial boundaries. The Millers built their reputation on being separate and superior, while all along." He trailed off, unable to fully articulate the magnitude of the deception. Tasha nodded, understanding the unfinished thought. "And I've been thinking about resistance," she replied. How our grandmothers must have recognized each other somehow, not just as allies, but as family. They found each other across all those manufactured divisions. Maybe that's why their connection was so strong. The implications extended beyond their personal histories. Jacob's position in Chicago's business community and his role in the Miller Foundation suddenly felt different. The charitable work he'd overseen now seemed paternalistic and shallow compared to the deep, committed partnership their grandmothers had forged. Everything I thought I knew about my family's place in the city, about who we are and what we represent, it all needs to be reevaluated, Jacob admitted, his usual confidence replaced by genuine soul-searching. The Foundation's entire approach to community support is built on maintaining distance between helper and helped. But that distance is a lie. Tasha reached across the table, her hand finding his in a gesture that would have seemed impossible just months ago. Maybe that's exactly what our grandmothers wanted us to discover. Not just our connection, but the artificial nature of the barriers between us. They left us breadcrumbs to follow, knowing that someday we'd be ready to understand. The conference room at the Miller Foundation had never hosted a meeting quite like this one. Jacob sat at the head of the table, but instead of the usual board members in expensive suits, the room was filled with community leaders, activists, and local residents. Tasha stood beside him, her grandmother's jewelry catching the light as she outlined their vision for a new kind of community partnership. Their proposal challenged a very established foundation protocol. Instead of top-down grant-making, they presented a model of collaborative community investment where local residents would have equal say in funding decisions. The traditional power dynamics that had defined Chicago's philanthropic landscape for generations were about to shift fundamentally. For too long, Jacob addressed the gathered group, his voice carrying the weight of personal transformation. We've operated under the illusion that communities in need are somehow separate from us. Our own family history proves the separation is artificial. The Miller Foundation needs to evolve from being a distant benefactor to becoming a true community partner. Some board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats as Jacob continued to detail how their recent discovery had forced him to confront the Foundation's paternalistic approach. He explained how his grandmother and Tasha's had created real change through genuine partnership, not charitable condescension. This revelation had shown him a new way forward. Tasha took over, explaining the practical aspects of their proposal. We're not just talking about redistributing funds, she emphasized. We're talking about redistributing power. Every decision will involve equal representation from the Foundation and the community. We're creating a model of truly collaborative philanthropy. The initiative they proposed would start in Tasha's old neighborhood, but was designed to expand across Chicago's South and West Sides. It would include a comprehensive review of the Foundation's investment portfolio, ensuring their financial investments aligned with community interests. They proposed converting several Miller Foundation properties into community-owned spaces, managed through a cooperative structure. The resistance was immediate and predictable. Board members raised concerns about fiscal responsibility, about maintaining the Foundation's prestigious reputation, about setting dangerous precedents. But Jacob and Tasha had anticipated every objection. They presented research showing how community-led initiatives consistently outperformed traditional charitable projects in creating lasting change. My grandmother understood something fundamental about community transformation. Tasha addressed the skeptics. She knew that lasting change comes from within communities, not from outside saviors. What we're proposing isn't radical. It's a return to the kind of collaborative work our grandmothers did in secret decades ago. Jacob's family members on the board struggled most with the implications. His cousin Richard, always protective of the Miller legacy, spoke up. This could fundamentally alter how people view the Miller name in Chicago. Everything our family is built, Jacob interrupted firmly, was possible because of connections and contributions that have gone unacknowledged for too long. We're not destroying the Miller legacy. We're finally telling its full story. As the meeting progressed, they unveiled more details of their plan. They would establish a Truth and Reconciliation Committee to examine the Foundation's history, acknowledging past harm while building toward a more equitable future. They proposed creating a youth leadership program that would bring together young people from across Chicago's divided neighborhoods, breaking down barriers early. The community members present began adding their own ideas, the room's energy shifting from skepticism to possibility. A local teacher suggested incorporating oral history projects to document community stories. A small business owner proposed creating a micro-lending program based on community trust rather than traditional credit metrics. The community celebration they'd organized transformed the old neighborhood's main street into a vibrant gathering space. String lights crisscrossed overhead, and the aroma of food from local restaurants filled the air. The event was meant to celebrate the launch of their new community initiative, but fate had other plans for the evening's significance. Marcus Thompson, a weathered man in his 80s who had been the neighborhood's unofficial historian for decades, approached them as they stood near the community mural. His eyes carried the weight of a secret long held, and his hands clutched a worn leather portfolio that seemed to demand attention. "I've been waiting for the right time," he began, his voice carrying the gravelly texture of years. "Your grandmothers made me promise to keep these safe until the day their grandchildren found their way back to each other. They knew this day would come." Inside the portfolio, Marcus had preserved a collection of letters, photographs, and documents that told a story far more profound than either Jacob or Tasha had imagined. The truth emerged through yellowed pages and faded ink. Elizabeth Miller and Rose Green hadn't just been friends, they had been sisters-in-law, connected through a love story that challenged every social boundary of their time. Elizabeth's brother, James Miller, and Rose's sister, Sarah Green, had fallen in love while working together in the civil rights movement. Their relationship, forbidden by the social standards of the time, had been kept secret to protect both families. They had married in a private ceremony, witnessed only by Elizabeth and Rose, before moving to Canada to build a life together. Jacob felt the world shift beneath his feet as Marcus showed them a photograph of James and Sarah on their wedding day, Elizabeth and Rose standing beside them as witnesses. The resemblance between James and Jacob was striking, the same determined set of the jaw, the same intensity in their eyes. "Your fathers," Marcus explained gently, "were cousins, which makes you second cousins, not third as the DNA test suggested." The test didn't tell the whole story, because some records were deliberately obscured to protect her grandparents' siblings. Tasha's hand found her grandmother's necklace as the truth settled over her. "The jewelry," she said softly. "It wasn't just given as a symbol of friendship. It was a family inheritance, passed between sisters." The revelation transformed their understanding of everything: their grandmother's close friendship, the careful documentation they'd left behind, their shared commitment to social justice. Elizabeth and Rose hadn't just been allies in the fight for civil rights. They had been protecting their own family story, preserving it for a time when the truth could finally be told. The implications rippled through the gathering crowd as Marcus shared more details. The Miller Foundation hadn't just been a charitable organization. It had been a vehicle for Elizabeth to protect and support her extended family and their community, working in secret with Rose to channel resources where they were needed most. Jacob addressed the assembled community, his voice thick with emotion but clear in purpose. "Our grandmothers understood something profound, that love and courage can transcend the boundaries society creates. They protected this truth so that we could one day transform it from a secret into a celebration." Tasha picked up where he left off, understanding flowing between them. Their legacy isn't just about the past, it's a blueprint for our future. They showed us that real change comes when we recognize and honor our connections, when we break down the artificial barriers that separate us. The event transformed into something more profound than a community celebration. It became a moment of recognition, of acknowledging the complex web of relationships that had always existed beneath the surface of Chicago's segregated society. The truth of their family story became a powerful symbol of hope and possibility, demonstrating that the lines dividing communities had always been more permeable than anyone had admitted. This revelation completed the IR journey, not by providing simple answers, but by opening up new possibilities. Jacob and Tasha now understood that they weren't just carrying on their grandmother's work. They were fulfilling a vision that had begun generations ago, when two families dared to imagine a future where love could triumph over social boundaries and where truth, though long buried, would eventually find its way to light.